In the late 13th century, amid the crumbling remnants of the Seljuk Sultanate and the slow decay of Byzantine rule, a tribal leader named Osman I emerged in the frontier lands of Anatolia. His mission was not just to conquer territory, it was to reshape it with the guiding principles of Islam. As the founder of the Ottoman Empire, Osman I's earliest ambitions were inseparable from his religious identity. In the regions he subdued, he saw not just land but opportunity, a place where faith, governance, and justice could be reborn under Islamic law. Osman's path to power was marked by a fusion of military strength and spiritual purpose. From the beginning, he aligned himself with religious scholars, Sufi leaders, and dervishes. Most notable among them was Sheikh Edebali, whose influence on Osman was both personal and political. Edebali was not only Osman's spiritual guide, but also became his father-in-law. His teachings deeply shaped Osman's belief in just rule, piety, and the spiritual responsibilities of leadership. This relationship anchored Osman's worldview and solidified his commitment to promoting Islam in the lands he would eventually govern. Osman's earliest conquests were along the Byzantine frontier regions that were religiously diverse and politically fractured. These areas were ideal for gradual expansion, but Osman's approach was not rooted in harsh suppression or forced conversion. Instead, he promoted Islamic values through example, inclusivity, and administrative fairness. His forces, known as Ghazis, were warriors who considered their battles part of a divine struggle, jihad in the sense of defending and spreading the faith. But this jihad was not defined by brutality. It was a movement of justice and order, one that appealed to many under Byzantine neglect. In newly conquered towns and villages, Osman allowed Christian communities to maintain their places of worship and their traditions, as long as they acknowledged Ottoman rule and paid taxes. However, at the same time, he introduced Islamic governance systems, including the appointment of Qadis Islamic judges who would implement Sharia law in matters of justice among Muslims. Mosques were built Islamic. Education began to take root, and Friday sermons were delivered in Osman's name, a public declaration of Islamic leadership. These steps signaled the beginning of Islamic rule in regions that had been largely Christian and disorganized. Osman's military victories were often followed not just by settlement of soldiers, but by the migration of religious scholars and Sufi mystics who would preach, teach, and serve as moral guides in these new communities. These figures were instrumental in promoting Islamic ethics, law, and culture among both the existing Muslim populations and newly encountered groups. Their presence was not only religious, it was political, shaping how Osman's new subjects understood power, justice, and social order. The Islamization of these territories was gradual but powerful, rooted in local trust, institutional fairness, and moral example. This method, gentle yet firm, made Osman's rule appealing to many. His version of Islamic leadership didn't alienate local populations. Instead, it created a system in which diverse communities could exist under an umbrella of Muslim rule that offered protection, economic stability, and moral clarity. For many people, especially those tired of Byzantine corruption or lawlessness, Osman's rule wasn't just tolerable, it was welcome. Importantly, Osman didn't enforce Islam through fear. He expanded it by building a state identity tied to religion, where Islamic principles were not only preached but practiced at every level of governance. His actions laid the groundwork for the future millet system, where religious minorities would be officially recognized under Islamic administration. Though the millet system was formalized later, its roots can be traced to Osman's early policies of coexistence and respect. Osman I's role was, in many ways, a revival of the Islamic ideal of a just and moral society. In these formative years, his conquests were not merely about land, they were about laying a spiritual foundation. His belief that rulership was a trust from God, not just a title of power, informed every decision he made. From the battlefield to the courtroom, from the marketplace to the mosque, Osman planted the seeds of a society where Islam would be more than a religion. It would be a system of life, law, and leadership. As Osman I's principality expanded through Anatolia's fragmented frontier, the challenge was no longer just conquest, it was consolidation. How would a leader maintain peace and unity in lands where ethnic, linguistic, and religious diversity prevailed? Osman's solution was not brute enforcement, but institutional Islamization, a system built on justice, ethics, and faith. He understood that for Islamic rule to endure, it had to live not just in prayer halls but in courts, markets, schools, and family life. And so, Osman turned his early state into a vessel of Islamic values through well-placed policies and structures. Central to this vision was the appointment of Qadis, Islamic judges who administered Sharia law and handled disputes ranging from property inheritance to criminal matters. Among Muslims, the Qadi was not merely a legal authority but a symbol of Islamic presence. By placing a Qadi in each town under his rule, Osman made Islamic justice visible and accessible. This empowered local communities to resolve issues under divine law, fostering respect for the new administration and reducing lawlessness. The moral uprightness expected from Qadis elevated the reputation of Ottoman rule, drawing admiration even from non-Muslim populations who were allowed to resolve internal issues under their own customs. Osman also encouraged the establishment of mosques and madrasas, which served as both places of worship and centers of education. In towns that previously had no structured learning systems, this was revolutionary. Islamic scholars were invited to teach Quranic studies, ethics, Arabic, and jurisprudence. For many people in these frontier regions, this was their first exposure to organized religious learning. These institutions created a cultural shift. Generations of children now grew up under a shared Islamic moral framework, regardless of their ethnic origin. The Turkic tribes, in particular, were deeply influenced by this emerging religious structure, which replaced older nomadic traditions with more settled and principled Islamic lifestyles. Equally transformative was Osman's integration of Sufi orders into his state building. Sufis played a crucial role in converting the hearts of people, not through fear or decree, but through kindness, spirituality, and example. Dervish lodges known as Saviyas became spiritual sanctuaries where travelers, converts, and commoners could find food, shelter, and guidance. These spaces were critical in building bonds across communities, strengthening the idea of unity under Islam. Sufis like Sheikh Edebali were not only spiritual advisors but cultural bridges, softening tensions and shaping the hearts of new converts through compassion and wisdom. Another notable feature of Osman's Islamic governance was the Waqf system, charitable endowments for public services. Although formal Waqf administration developed later, Osman laid its early foundation. Wealthy Muslims, inspired by Islamic teachings on charity, began donating land or revenue to support mosques, schools, or roads. These waqfs allowed the community to sustain itself without direct state intervention, reducing the economic burden on the treasury and reinforcing a faith-based culture of giving and responsibility. This self-sustaining model of charity made Islam not just a belief system, but a practical solution to everyday life under Ottoman rule. Importantly, Osman did not isolate Islam as an exclusive club. His Islamic rule was inclusive, yet firm. Non-Muslims were not forced to convert, but they were expected to respect the moral order and contribute to society. Christians and Jews lived under what would later be formalized as dhimmi status, a protected status that allowed them to practice their religion while paying a small tax in return for exemption from military service. This model, inspired by the Prophet Muhammad's governance in Medina, allowed Osman to grow his population without widespread resistance. It also enhanced the legitimacy of Islamic governance as balanced, just, and merciful. This careful blend of faith and practicality became the hallmark of Ottoman expansion. Osman's system didn't rely solely on swords, it relied on structures. His goal was not just to win battles, but to win trust. In doing so, he built a society where Islamic law was not just written in books, but lived out in streets, homes, courts, and souls. His subjects, Muslim or otherwise, came to see Ottoman rule as orderly and moral, especially compared to the fragmented, corrupt Byzantine frontier they had left behind. By the time of his death, Osman I had created more than a military stronghold. He had established a living moral order, one that would shape the Ottoman worldview for centuries. The society he nurtured wasn't just led by Muslims, it was guided by Islam. Faith wasn't a slogan under Osman's leadership. It was the blueprint. As Osman I neared the end of his life, the lands under his control had grown from a minor tribal territory to a thriving principality rooted in Islamic principles. Yet his true achievement wasn't measured merely by land or military victories. It was found in the enduring framework he established, one where Islam shaped not only personal belief, but also political philosophy, justice systems, education, and daily life. This holistic approach to governance ensured that the Islamic rule Osman implemented didn't vanish with him. Instead, it became the blueprint for a vast empire that would last over 6 centuries. Osman's passing around 1324 marked the beginning of a dynasty that would carry his vision forward, but his successors didn't need to invent a new strategy. They simply expanded the system he had already built. His son Orhan would formalize many of his father's initiatives, turning the principality into a proper state. But at the core of that transition was the same set of Islamic values that Osman had championed: justice, consultation, trust, and service. One of the most profound aspects of Osman's legacy was his ability to embed Islam into state identity without coercion. By the time Ottoman armies reached places like Bursa and later Constantinople, Islamic governance was not just about applying Sharia in court. It was about building entire cities around mosques, madrasas, soup kitchens, and libraries. This model of urban Islamization had its origins in Osman's earliest towns, where infrastructure was built around spiritual and moral centers. His emphasis on the mosque as the community's heart laid the foundation for city planning that would endure for centuries. Osman's leadership style also gave birth to a political culture where rulers were expected to be moral guardians, not just military commanders. He wasn't a king in a palace commanding from afar. He was a servant leader who led prayers, resolved disputes, and met his people face to face. This closeness to the people became a standard for future Ottoman rulers, especially in their early centuries. Even as the empire grew, the idea that the Sultan was the shadow of God on earth carried a spiritual responsibility that originated in Osman's example. The concept of the Ghazi, a warrior of the faith, was also part of Osman's long-term influence. He and his followers didn't fight merely for land or gold. They believed they were fulfilling a sacred mission. This sense of divine duty gave Ottoman conquests a spiritual tone, distinguishing them from purely material wars of expansion. The Ghazi identity, nurtured by Osman, became a powerful unifier among Turkic tribes and Islamic warriors alike. It was this shared spiritual purpose that kept the empire cohesive, especially in its formative years. What made Osman's vision unique was how naturally faith merged with pragmatism. He did not try to erase local cultures or force conversion upon the non-Muslim population. Instead, he promoted Islam by creating a system that was so just, so well-ordered, and so ethically grounded that people respected and often gravitated toward it. This allowed for a peaceful expansion of Islamic influence, not just through military means, but through inspiration and governance. His ability to balance firmness with fairness became a defining trait of Ottoman administration. Another pillar of Osman's enduring legacy was his commitment to education as a means of Islamic empowerment. Though the formal Ottoman educational system was developed later, Osman had already emphasized the need for learning rooted in faith. Quranic schools, informal Sufi circles, and public readings of hadith and history helped develop a literate and morally aware population. In doing so, Osman ensured that Islam would not only live in mosques but also in minds and hearts. The early Ottomans were also unique in how they documented and honored Osman's Islamic contributions. Chronicles written decades after his death consistently portray him as a leader chosen by God, whose success came through piety and divine blessing. This was not just historical storytelling, it was a deliberate effort to shape the Ottoman identity around a founder who led with faith. Every Ottoman sultan who followed would invoke Osman's name, often during coronations or when girding the sword of Gaza, a sacred ritual where each new sultan would pledge to uphold the values of the founder. Perhaps the most symbolic proof of Osman's lasting Islamic legacy is his tomb in Bursa, which became a pilgrimage site for Ottoman rulers. Newly crowned sultans would visit the tomb to pray, seek blessing, and reaffirm their commitment to justice and Islam. This ritual wasn't political theater, it was a continuation of Osman's vision. A reminder that power was not a privilege but a trust from God. The sword they carried was not just a weapon, it was a responsibility. Osman, I didn't leave behind towering statues or royal monuments. His monument was a living system, a just court, a scholar teaching Quran, a mother raising her children with Islamic ethics, a city built around faith. These were the pillars of his legacy, intangible but indestructible. His leadership style, grounded in Islamic teachings and moral governance, became the soul of an empire. Even as the Ottomans reached Vienna in the west and Mecca in the south, they carried Osman's vision like a sacred torch. To this day, Osman I is remembered not just as a conqueror, but as a founder with faith, a man who transformed wild frontiers into structured communities guided by Islamic law and compassion. His life teaches that true power lies not just in strength, but in purpose. And that purpose, when aligned with faith and justice, can build a civilization that echoes across centuries.